On the last episode of the Great Emu-War, we covered Dolphin Emulator's removal from Steam after Nintendo issued a cease and desist to Steam's developer Valve. In that video, we discussed how the legality of emulation is not particularly robust, nor is it well defined, and that this legal ambiguity creates a sort of unspoken agreement between emulator developers like Dolphin or Yuzu and game/platform developers like Nintendo or Valve or Microsoft. We also discussed how if that unspoken agreement is broken and an emulator developer pushes the threshold of acceptability too far, a game developer might push the big red button and seek to resolve the legal ambiguity. If an emulator developer's actions pose too large a risk to the status quo or has the potential to cause too much damage, a game dev might be willing to accept the risk of having the law resolve against their interests. In other words, it is all a careful balancing act. Dolphin Emulator, as of the time of writing, still exists, though not on Steam. They've ceased pushing for a Steam release and have been, rather responsibly in my opinion, lying low. In the comments of that video on Dolphin, however, a single question frequently comes up. Mooney, what about Yuzu? Well, the arm of the law moves slowly, and evidence takes time to accumulate. It's like Monster Hunter. It takes more time, experience, and gear to defeat Nergigante than it takes to prevail over the Great Jagras. The way Nintendo engaged with Yuzu is far more serious in nature than how they engaged with Dolphin, and it is an important warning to the entire emulation community. We'll talk about what that warning might be later in this video. And so the Great Emu-War continues. About 8 months prior to the release of this video, Nintendo went after Dolphin Emulator's release on Steam, and now it appears Nintendo has indeed pushed the button and gone after Yuzu and its developers, Tropic Haze. Or has it? Is Nintendo's targeting of Yuzu emulator truly a sign of the emulation end times, or did Yuzu violate the unspoken emulation social contract somehow, perhaps by getting a little greedy in its pursuits? Let's find out together. This is Moon Channel Law Review on the Great Emu-War, and it's brought to you by returning sponsor, Brilliant. If you want to be a good lawyer, you have to develop your critical thinking skills, but one doesn't always have the time or the mental energy to go about that kind of self-improvement. Thankfully, there's Brilliant, a learning platform designed to teach without tedium. Brilliant teaches you complicated topics like math, programming, data analysis, and engineering through only 15 minutes of interactive problem solving a day. And because Brilliant customizes content to fit your needs, you can learn at your own pace, whether you're an experienced professional looking to brush up on your skills, or a rookie seeking to learn something new. And you can try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days by visiting brilliant.org/moonchannel or by clicking on the link in the description. You will also get 20% off an annual premium subscription by clicking on that link, so please do give it a try. Why settle for bright when you could be brilliant? Once again, that's brilliant.org/moonchannel. So what is a yuzu exactly? Well, yuzu is a small citrus fruit commonly used in Japanese cuisine, but for our purposes it is also the name of a Nintendo Switch emulator. An emulator, you will recall, is software that can mimic the capabilities of a video game console. Yuzu, as a Nintendo Switch emulator, emulates or reproduces the Nintendo Switch console, allowing one to play digital or physically reproduced copies of Switch games without actually owning the physical console, or indeed, the physical games. In other words, Yuzu lets you play Switch games without a Switch and potentially without a game. Yuzu is produced by One Tropic Haze LLC, a for-profit limited liability company. Tropic Haze was organized on March 22, 2021 in Rhode Island, relatively recently despite Yuzu's development beginning as early as January of 2018. It must also be noted that Yuzu was the second emulator developed by this same team, the first emulator being Citra, a 3DS emulator, and as such, this dev team has quite a long history of operation. As a side note, I know that Citra has essentially its own independent governance, but we won't get into that, or what ultimately happened to Citra in this video. According to Tropic Haze's annual filings, the character of business which is conducted in Rhode Island is self-reported as technology and specifically NAICS 541549, other computer-related services. Now, on or about February 26, 2024, Tropic Haze LLC, this for-profit business in the other computer-related services industry, was sued by Nintendo of America. To summarize quickly, Nintendo's complaint alleges the following. Number 1, that Tropic Haze LLC develops Yuzu, and that Yuzu allows Switch games that Nintendo authorizes solely for Switch consoles to be played on other devices, including pirated games. Number 2, that Nintendo designed the Switch with technological protection measures installed to prevent people from playing pirated copies of games, including the use of encryption that requires specific keys to unlock. Number 3, that Yuzu circumvented these technological protection measures and allowed for the use of independently acquired keys to break the Switch's encryption. Number 4, that Yuzu's website assists in facilitating the circumvention of these protections, and thus, number 5, that tremendous damage has been done to Nintendo and the third parties which publish on its platform. We'll get into these specific details in a moment, but just from the surface you might have noticed that the argument behind this complaint is something that Moon Channel veterans have seen not once, but actually twice. We saw this argument used by Nintendo, of course, against Dolphin. You may recall the letter sent by Jenner and Block LLP to Valve, wherein Nintendo presented a cleverly worded legal argument that skirts around the legal precedent protecting emulation that emerged from Sony v. Connectix. That's right, not Bleem, Connectix. If you're interested in that emulation law history, by the way, please check out the Point Crow video on modding and the Dolphin Emulator video, where we discuss how thin the protections surrounding emulation really are. In any case, long story short, the legal argument presented by Nintendo in that letter was not in the vein of reverse engineering language that emerged from Connectix concerning 17 U.S.C. Section 1201F, which forms the basis for current emulator legality, but instead is a circumvention of technological measures argument emerging from 17 U.S.C. Section 1201A1. A theory that has not really been tested yet in court, but is very well put together. It's not an argument that the emulation community has found a meaningful legal answer to. But there's another familiar argument that has been raised here, one that we saw used in the Gary Bowser video, the implications of which weren't entirely clear to me until I started writing this script. Nintendo laid some precedential legal groundwork for their circumvention argument in that case that wasn't immediately obvious due to other arguably more intriguing factors, pursuant to both 17 U.S.C. Section 1201A2 and 17 U.S.C. Section 1201B1, and indeed, Nintendo gives up the game here, as the complaint cites directly to Nintendo of America Incorporated versus Gary Bowser and United States versus Lois et al., amongst other cases, as a means of establishing federal precedent in favor of their position. They've been laying legal bricks behind the scenes and setting precedent this whole time. Quick side note, Nintendo does also make an argument pursuant to 17 U.S.C. 1061 and 501A, but these are red herrings and a bit of a stretch goal, we'll call it, ostensibly attempting to hold Yuzu secondarily liable for each act of infringement performed by Yuzu users. Maybe we'll come back to this in the future if anything actually happens surrounding this argument. In any case, the complaint makes it all very clear, and I quote, "This is a civil action seeking equitable relief and damages for unlawful circumvention of copyright protection systems, and unlawful trafficking in circumvention technology in violation of the DMCA 17 U.S.C. Section 1201. In other words, Nintendo's legal strategy is exactly as we predicted in the Dolphin Emulator video, augmented by the arguments they made in the Bowser video, and is, in fact, stronger now in hindsight than we had even surmised 8 months ago. If the big red button is pushed and the emulation community goes to war, it is more likely than not to lose. So what specifically did Yuzu do wrong here? Why was Yuzu given the hammer in so severe a manner? Why is Nintendo willing to risk the button? I'm still of the position that Nintendo would much prefer not to shake the status quo and push the button, but we also now know that their position is much more secure than we'd originally thought, and thus they are more likely to engage in conflict against actors in the emulation community who push the boundaries. What are those boundaries? What is most important to Nintendo? Well, I conjecture that it's quite simple. Number 1, is your emulator highly publicized and widely used? Number 2, is your emulator also being widely used to pirate games? And number 3, are you profiting from your emulator? If the answer to all of these questions is yes, then you might be a candidate for legal action. We then proceed to 3 follow-up questions. Number 1, do your actions in designing the emulator or running your emulation community fit Nintendo's legal theory? Number 2, are there real damages that Nintendo can calculate? And number 3, are you likely to yield instead of fight? If the answer to all 3 of those is also a yes, then a lawsuit becomes likely. Yuzu unfortunately checks all of those boxes, and the mistakes made by Tropic Haze LLC were serious and numerous. So what we have here is a for-profit LLC doing business in Rhode Island and other computer-related services, making money and paying a team of developers. But how is, or was, I should say, Tropic Haze making its money? Prior to being shut down, Yuzu was freely available to download, wasn't it? It was open source software. Well, Yuzu had a Patreon page through which it solicited donations. The complaint filed by Nintendo alleges that Yuzu's Patreon account had over 7,000 patrons, which earned Tropic Haze approximately $30,000 a month. Yuzu on the Google Play Store also had a paid version which earned another roughly $50,000 additional dollars. The free Android version, as stated in the complaint, has been downloaded over 1 million times and the paid version over 10,000 times. This is not including any revenue or downloads that might have been brought in concerning Citra, the 3DS emulator. We can corroborate these figures by looking at Graphtreon, which shows that Yuzu was still making about $30,000 a month, and that at its peak, Yuzu's Patreon was bringing in about $44,000 a month. Fun fact, when do you suppose this Patreon peak occurred? On what date? Well, it occurred between May 1st and May 22nd of 2023 because Tears of the Kingdom released on May 12th, 2023 and was allegedly playable early via a modded Patreon-gated early access build of Yuzu. By May 22nd, 2023, Yuzu was rank number 2 in profitability amongst all Patreons in the games category and remains in the top 10 to this very day. And therein lies a pretty substantial problem. It's tough to argue in good faith that people are downloading Yuzu here for preservation purposes, or for some other legal purpose related to this brand new AAA game. Remember, the emulator might be legal, but the ROMs almost certainly aren't. If you are playing Tears of the Kingdom on Yuzu in the months right after its launch, you essentially have to be doing so illegally. You can argue about the morality of that all you want, but all of this is within the context of law, and thus our logic must relate back to the law unless the law changes. The Yuzu team was completely aware of the extent of piracy, as Yuzu has a telemetry feature, which collects anonymous data about a user's use of their software. Nintendo's complaint cites to a Yuzu progress report for June 2023, which notes that according to Yuzu's data, Tears of the Kingdom is by far the most played game on Yuzu. But it's not just that Yuzu can play Tears of the Kingdom, it's that the ability to play Tears of the Kingdom at the time was gated behind a Patreon paywall. Hence the stratospheric increase in patrons, an especially egregious action that is likely to invite scrutiny. This rather curious but highly profitable decision was cited to directly in Nintendo's complaint, and I quote, "Although Yuzu can be downloaded for free, defendant maintains a Patreon page for the Yuzu team, which solicits monthly donations for the project in exchange for early access to daily updates and special unreleased features." As such, we see that Yuzu has triggered all 3 of the initial questions Nintendo might raise. Number 1, Yuzu is ostensibly the biggest dog in emulation with an enormous user base and community. Number 2, as much as we'd like to pretend otherwise, the primary use case for Yuzu is to pirate games, and the Yuzu team is completely aware that their emulator is being used primarily and extensively for piracy. And number 3, the Yuzu team is profiting enormously off of their Patreon and App Store sales, in the realm of 7 figures, and indeed, so much so that they established an LLC for what I'd imagine are governance liability and tax purposes. So now that those 3 criteria have been met and you've invited the gaze of the lidless eye upon you, we move to our follow-up questions. Number 1, do your actions in designing the emulator or running your emulation community fit into our legal theory? Number 2, are there real damages that we can calculate? And number 3, are you likely to yield instead of fight? Starting with Yuzu's specific actions relative to Nintendo's legal theory, let's summarize the legal theory quickly. Are you circumventing the technological measures we are using to control access to our copyrighted work, or trafficking in devices or software designed to circumvent technological measures we are using to control access to our copyrighted work? What are these technological measures? Well, Nintendo states that it uses 3 different technological measures to control access to its works, something that it is indeed allowed to and vaguely encouraged to do by law. These measures are, number 1, Nintendo eShop games, digital games that is, are accompanied by an encrypted identifier, a cryptographic key, that the Nintendo console then confirms to verify that said game file is authentic. Number 2, each game uses industry standard AES-128 encryption, which makes a game file, and I quote, useless unless the user possesses the specific cryptographic key to decrypt it, a key created by and known only to Nintendo. Nintendo paraphrases this by stating that, in other words, the key to unlock the game file is itself encrypted with another cryptographic key. Imagine 2 chests. One chest has the treasure of the game you want to play. The other chest has the key to the treasure-filled chest, but is locked itself by a different series of keys. The outer series of keys are what are called prod keys, and the prod keys unlock the key-bearing chest to yield the title key, which then unlocks the chest with the game inside. Prod keys unlock the title key unlocks the game. Now, the third technological measure is built into the console itself, what Nintendo calls console measures, encrypted signatures that are checked when the console boots up to confirm that the console itself is authentic. Now that we know what these technological measures are, what is Nintendo's legal theory surrounding them? Well, we talked about it a little before, but to summarize, Nintendo is stating that bypassing these cryptographic protections is tantamount to a circumvention of technological measures used to safeguard against Nintendo's copyrighted works. Is this a strong legal theory? And could one use old emulation legal precedent to fight it? Well, it's hard to say, as again, none of this is battle-tested, but I'm of the opinion that this is a very well put together argument. And we've seen Nintendo achieve victories already outside of the emulation space against Gary Bowser and Team Executor, for example, using a portion of this argument. Could one use old emulation reverse engineering legal precedent to fight it? Ostensibly, but I don't think it's sufficient. It's barking up the wrong tree. This is a novel argument built upon a novel defense mechanism, and it remains to be seen whether the deeply tech-unsavvy courts will be willing to associate the bypassing of purposeful encryption with reverse engineering. My guess is that they won't. So has Yuzu or Tropic Haze LLC actually done anything that fits this legal theory? If Nintendo's legal theory is to be believed, then unequivocally and unfortunately yes. Yuzu's website had a quick start guide with instructions and, worse yet, links directing readers to so-called unlawful methods of obtaining the prod keys. The hesitancy to host these keys themselves betrays Yuzu's thoughts on their legality. Linking them is arguably tantamount to hosting them, though. The difference is that Yuzu hoped to pass the buck of responsibility. Nintendo even provides the receipts by noting in their complaint that Yuzu's lead developer Bunny has stated on the record that users should, and I quote, probably just pirate a Yuzu folder with everything. The Quick Start Guide produced by the Yuzu team also notes specifically that Yuzu needs some files from hackable Nintendo Switch consoles to be used properly. Hackable is bolded and in caps because Nintendo patched this hack in June of 2018. Thus, Nintendo argues, the Quick Start Guide directly requests that users circumvent the console protections and the cryptographic technological measures, and links directly to circumvention software like the appropriately named Lockpick. Thus, before we even get into what Yuzu actually does, the Yuzu dev team has made some very serious mistakes in producing a quick start guide that all but requests the user make several legally dubious decisions that, when applied to Nintendo's legal theory, are all unlawful. As to what Yuzu the emulator actually does, if one has the prod keys from a quote-unquote real Switch, Yuzu can put the locked-picked keys into the title key chest, take out the title key and unlock the main chest by itself. Nintendo argues that this is, in and of itself, a circumvention of technological measures, as the decrypting that Yuzu does is also without Nintendo's authorization. It also constitutes a circumvention of technological measures, hence why this legal theory is so incredibly deadly and well put together. It has multiple viable pathways to success that cannot be defeated by a single argument. And with the complete reveal of Nintendo's legal strategy, we now see that virtually all emulators that involve the manipulation of these cryptographic keys are vulnerable. Yuzu's lead dev Bunny seems to corroborate Nintendo's theory, The complaint cites to a June 2018 Discord chat in which a user asks whether the XCIS file type, the ROM file type, comes decrypted. Bunny responds that they are encrypted. As such, the lead developer openly, albeit indirectly, admits that decryption is taking place on the emulator side of the equation. It's also on the record that lead dev Bunny often gets new Switch games running the day of, or at times even the day before, a game's release, an act which necessitates the team having dumped games and circumvented technological measures, in accordance with Nintendo's legal theory. This might have been harder for Nintendo to prove if Bunny didn't make posts like these, wherein they state on Discord that ROMs are playable day of and for users to manipulate cryptographic keys following the quick start guide. On to question 2 then, are there real damages that we can calculate? As we've seen, there are. Nintendo points to the once 70,000 Redditor-strong Yuzu piracy subreddit, and to the circulation of pirated Tears of the Kingdom ROMs 2 weeks prior to the actual release of the game. With 1 million downloads of said pirated ROM actively tracked by Nintendo, with Nintendo claiming and even providing screenshots of Tears of the Kingdom running on modded Yuzu prior to the release of the actual game. Now look, I completely understand. Not every pirated copy of a game is a sale. Maybe you wouldn't have bought Tears of the Kingdom anyway, and so the piracy doesn't actually cause real damage, right? But we must also ask, can we definitively say that every single pirated copy of a game isn't a potential sale? Are they all like you? This equation works both ways, and here we have actual numbers. Yuzu's dev team made over $1 million on Patreon producing Yuzu, and there was an enormous increase in support that coincides with Tears of the Kingdom. Can we say that no sales have ever been lost due to Yuzu? Almost certainly not, and as such there are likely damages. How much in damages exactly? Well, the court didn't decide this time. Is it as much as 2.4 million, the final amount that Tropic Haze agreed to pay? Again, I can't tell you, and I wouldn't trust anyone who says that they could. Maybe it's a lot less, maybe it's a lot more. But in my opinion, Tropic Haze got off relatively easy, and that, I suspect, is because of question number 3. Are you likely to yield instead of fight? The Yuzu team was arguably irresponsible in their behavior. The Discord logs, the quick start guide, the enormous amount of money they made. This flaunting of publicity and profit was sure to result in deep scrutiny by Nintendo's lawyers, which, as we see, has yielded this result. But I do think that Yuzu did the responsible thing by surrendering instead of choosing to fight this out. In this case, I completely believe that Nintendo would have pushed the big red button instead of backing down because Yuzu had set up a perfect battlefield in which Nintendo could win. If Yuzu had chosen to fight it out, given this body of facts, I strongly feel that they would have been mulched in court, and with them, the entirety of emulation as we know it. But I'd imagine that Nintendo is still probably happy that they didn't have to push the button, as the status quo still works for them. And now the status quo has shifted a bit, and a red line in the sand has appeared. A warning to all emulator developers: heed our criteria or we will make precedent out of you. We can see this in the agreed upon settlement. Nintendo could have squeezed Yuzu for all it's worth, and Tropic Haze is still likely to have capitulated. Instead, we have a rather sane calculation of agreed upon monetary relief: $2,400,000, ostensibly Yuzu's current monthly Patreon income of $29,000, multiplied by the months the Switch has been released, which is 83 months, which comes out to $2,407,000. So, in clear terms, what is the purported warning, and what are the steps one can take to protect oneself? The warning is this: if you're going to develop an emulator that manipulates our cryptographic keys, don't do it. But if you insist on doing it, then keep your head down, don't flaunt it, and don't make money off of it such that you could present as a legal threat if we let you grow unchecked. Maybe also keep in mind that Discord logs are public record, and that it's not safe to have legally consequential discussions on Discord. Nintendo says, if you insist on publicity, if you insist on making money off of emulation, then we are prepared to test our legal theory on you. The consequences here are, of course, substantial. Let's not pretend that this is a warning without weight. We've seen many emulation developers in recent days call it quits precisely because they've tried to push the envelope in terms of publicity or profitability. and they can read the signs. None of them want to be next, and you better believe that Nintendo is ready and willing now to tango, given how strong of an argument and precedential foundation they've built. If virtually every Nintendo emulator involves some manipulation of cryptographic keys, then every Nintendo emulator also falls into Nintendo's legal theory. Before we conclude this video, let's also take a look at a few questions I've seen floating around the internet and a few questions from Moon Channel viewers. Will the devs be okay? Likely so. The LLC should protect any individuals from liability unless someone pierced the corporate veil and invited personal liability upon themselves. In truth, though, Nintendo doesn't likely actually care very much about that $2,400,000. Its real purpose is to be a scary number, a deterrent, if you will. I won't get too deep into the corporate law stuff. I suspect the devs will be fine. What about all the hearsay surrounding Yuzu and their interactions with Ryujinx, or their personal Discord logs, or the ostensible Google Drive folder full of pirated ROMs on Discord? Hearsay, as we say, is hearsay. I'm staying rather purposefully within the four corners of Nintendo's complaint in terms of allegations. If it is outside of Nintendo's concern, it's not within the scope of this video. What about Citra, or all the other clones of Yuzu like Suyu? What about the many emulators now closing up shop? What about Ryujinx? These are all outside of the scope of this video as well. Development of Citra emulator by Tropic Haze was also terminated as per the final agreement. Concerning clones like Suyu, one can clone Yuzu as many times as one wants, and I'm sure there will be some DMCA whack-a-mole going on in the short term. In the long term, though, without the funding or devs that Yuzu had, these forks will inevitably fall behind in the arms race, perhaps resorting to plagiarism of other more successful emulators. They will slowly become obsolete. Or they might become large and competent enough to be taken out in the same way, paying Nintendo's lawyers as they go along. Who can say? As for Ryujinx, well, they're being a bit smarter about keeping their heads down, or at least I hope that's the case. And I believe that they're based in Brazil, which helps a little, but not as much as you might think. That's a topic for another video though. Moving on to viewer Q&A on this topic, at MatthewGalaxy9663 asks, is Nintendo's footing as solid as they are posturing, or is this more in line with a slapsuit? Make no mistake, this is absolutely not a slapsuit. As I'm sure Yuzu's lawyers might have told them, this is a very carefully put together complaint with a lot of moving parts, and they more or less had Yuzu dead to rights. It was a very pretty looking fact pattern that I'm sure Nintendo wouldn't have minded litigating. Nintendo's decision to drop the matter for a reasonable deterrence settlement, however, tells me that they are happy not to push the big red button for now. But it's clear also that they are absolutely preparing to push it in the future if the opportunity presents itself. Their strategy hasn't been wholly tested in combat, but it needs to be taken very, very seriously. At SuperBro6413 asks, what specifically was Nintendo asserting in their lawsuit filings against Yuzu? What claims are just assertions or haven't been proven? The 1201B claims have been field tested against hardware pirates but not against emulators. Nintendo would have to succeed at tying the two together through legal argument. The 1201A claims are largely untested, but they're pretty compelling, which is problematic. In your question, you mentioned that a different YouTuber, I believe, named Nerol, mentioned gray areas in the law, and that is absolutely true. It's important to remember, though, that ambiguity does not equal permission, and that the best interpretations that we have right now suggest that Nintendo's present strategy is a pretty strong one. This is not a legal argument that we can reject by simply saying, actually, it's totally legal. There is, indeed, nothing substantive that I'm aware of that one could use to directly combat this theory, and a lot of the theory crafting I've seen going on, let's say, Reddit, is, to put it kindly, seriously misinformed and /or naive. And finally, at m.greenfield6328 asks, was it best for Yuzu to fold before going to court? Could a case between Nintendo and a different emulator's devs end up overturning that ruling? Even if a dev has a better leg to stand on than Yuzu, is there anything stopping Nintendo from targeting them? Could Nintendo just bully emulation developers by drawing out legal cases they shouldn't be able to win to bleed those teams dry? How would this affect Connectix if it went to court? That's a lot of questions. But to answer them simply, yes. It was best for Yuzu to capitulate. Yes, a different emulator dev prevailing over Nintendo could potentially change the outcome of this ruling, but that's complicated and not automatic. Yes, there is something stopping Nintendo from targeting other devs, and that is time and money. If the other emulator devs are willing to fly under the radar and be less of a problem than the cost to solve the problem, then they will not likely be targeted. For now, that seems to be Nintendo's modus operandi. But there is an implication here that this could change given how robust Nintendo's strategy appears to be. And lastly, if this case went to court, it's hard to tell how it would affect the outcome of Connectix. The answer is likely that it wouldn't touch upon Connectix per se, but that it will obsolete the protections of Connectix due to emulation being made all but illegal through a different mechanism of legal action. I hope that answers your questions. If I didn't get to your questions, I likely felt that the video itself was enough to answer them. But I do read all of your questions on the community posts, so I hope that you will not feel as if I've ignored you. As I said in the Dolphin video, emulation is a little bubble of Meadowland, a precious anomaly in the otherwise industrial wasteland of intellectual property. And it's on the emulation community to decide whether to preserve this Meadowland or to fight to expand it. Along the way, people will want to do what people always do. They will want to make money. They will want to expand and build industry in the Meadowland, so to speak. And these goals do not and cannot coexist in the current legal landscape. The capitulation of the Yuzu factory, sad as it may be, means that our little meadow has been preserved for now. But the doomsday clock has ticked down, and the field of emulation might need to either engage in reform or otherwise face a reckoning. If, however, you are part of a dev team that wants to clutch your dollars and stare down the beast, remember this: the lidless eye never blinks. I've been your host, Mooney. My sincerest apologies for how messy this video is. I'm just getting back from a month-long hiatus, which you can read about in the community posts if you like. But I do hope you still found this video informative and enjoyable. Thank you, as always, for tuning in to Moon Channel.